Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Those today in New York as part of the Summit of the Future event and all connecting from far. Thank you so much for joining. I'm first going to hand over to my colleague Arturo Cortez from Forus to explain interpretation for the event.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and welcome everybody to this side event of the Summit of the Future. We would like to remind you that we have simultaneous interpretation into English, French, and Spanish. So please make sure that you select your language by clicking on the globe-shaped button that you will find at the bottom of your screen. And please stay in the same channel during the whole meeting. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue à cet événement parallèle du Sommet de l'Avenir. Nous voudrions vous rappeler que nous avons une interprétation simultanée en français, espagnol et anglais pendant cet événement. Assurez-vous de sélectionner votre langue et de rester dans le même canal pendant toute la réunion. Merci beaucoup. Hola a todos y a todas, bienvenidos a este evento paralelo de la Cumbre del Futuro. Les recordamos que tenemos interpretación simultánea en inglés, francés y español. Asegúrese de seleccionar su idioma haciendo clic en el botón que aparece en la parte baja de su pantalla en forma de globo terráqueo y permanezca en el mismo canal durante toda la reunión. Muchas gracias. Before we begin, we would like to say thank you to the members of the pool of interpreters of Forus that are working with us, to Roberto Sanchez, Carolina Valezzi, Elizabeth Baca, and Sebastian Wassersug. Thank you very much. And also, we would like to inform you that during this meeting, we would be using artificial intelligence to capture key steps, and we won't use that information for any other purposes, and we won't share it also externally. So thank you very much. And now back to you, Marianne. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arturo. So my name is Marianne Buenaventura Goldman. I'm representing Forus and leading the work on financing for sustainable development. I'm pleased to be the event moderator for our event today on redefining and enhancing the quality of official development assistance, ODA, for sustainable development as part of the official program of the Summit of the Future. To kick us off, I'd like to introduce our colleague Olusei Babatunde Oibisi. We call our colleague Oibisi, representing the National Network of Nigerian National Network of NGOs, to welcome and provide comments for this event today. Over to you, Oibisi.
Yes, thank you so much, Marianne, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world today. Let me thank the panelists that are joining us. Let me also thank all the participants, including also the organizers, for bringing all of us together to discuss this very important topic around the ODA, the Official Development Assistance. And you all agree with me that amidst the global challenges that we have, especially for those of us in the global south, the ODA is important within the context of sustainable development, climate change, and also peace and security. And let me emphasize that the discussions today would help us in being able to frame the need for there to be that shift in power as it regards how we focus on development, but also how we finance that as well. For us, that's recipient countries and also other countries joining us. These conversations are very much important, especially when we now need to look at how do we redefine ODA to also how we enhance its quality and also coherence, including also promoting localization. I must also stress that the need for ODA should go beyond the traditional benchmarks, such as the 0.7% GNI target, and ensuring that it is now more genuine and genuine in a way that addresses the needs of communities, especially that of the global south. Let me acknowledge that in this room, we have civil society leaders, we have international organizations and governments. And, you know, the importance of this multi-stakeholder approach to a conversation like this is very much important, especially the collaboration that is needed in us being able to shape the future of ODA. The conversations today should be about bold ideas, solutions, new ways of thinking, and also how best we can reflect the thinking of recipient countries in how ODA is administered and also implemented, especially their perspectives and also their needs. Today also, we should also look at how to, reflect on ODA's effectiveness, the transparency that needs to come around that, and the level of inclusivity that we now need. And on that note, let me welcome you all once again and hand over back to Marian.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, OABC. We are going to have two panels for this event. The first panel will be focusing on redefining ODA and shifting the power. Our moderator for this first panel is Mr. Zia Rehman. He's the National Chair of Pakistan Development Alliance and also the coordinator of Asia Development Alliance. Over to you, Zia.
So thank you very much indeed, Marianne. And thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today for this very important conversation. I have a very eminent scholars and leaders who will be actually talking about the official development assistance and its effectiveness and how we can actually improve its localization and engage with various people and governments in Global South and how it can be made more effective. I would like to introduce all my three panelists. We will have Luca Di Fraia. She is the ActionAid Italia representative, and she will be talking about the definition of ODA, and then it will be the conversation will be joined by Vitalis Meja. She is the co-chair of Finance for Development Mechanism in the International Development Cooperation workstream, and she will be talking about the redefining ODA. And finally, our conversation will be joined by Mr. Ali Kamal, the Chief of Planning Commission in Pakistan. He will be talking about localization and the Global South perspective of ODA. So without any further ado, I would like to first invite Luca Di Fraia from ActionAid Italia to share with us the current definition of ODA. And Fraia, how do you see donors countries interpreting this definition, and what challenges do you think this presents for the recipient countries? So over to you, Fraia.
Thank you, Zia, and thank you all for joining this conversation and for inviting me to offer some views. This is a massive issue, the definition of ODA, so I'm going to limit myself to 5 minutes, and you can say a lot in 5 minutes. I'm going to do my best. So let me start by sharing that whenever I come across the term ODA, I tend to think about 3 different things at the very least. ODA is a type of flow. We talk about grants and concessional loans, so it's type of flow. At the same time, ODA, well, when you hear ODA, you immediately think about a 0.7% target. So it's a commitment. And then you have the rules that actually can tell you what is in, out, or ODA. So frankly speaking with you, whenever I think about in terms of ODA, I have these 3 things in mind: a type of flow, commitment, and rules, set of rules. And I would invite you to think along these lines to really get a sense of where we stand today. And let me next step say that when it comes to tracking ODA, well, we know that is a very complex matter, and our main concern as CSOs is to make sure that ODA is actually going to local communities and partner countries. But I think no one is objecting that ODA is concessional resources. And, well, let me add that there might be arguments against the notion of a target. I have heard many recent conversations about a target might be counterproductive, but I would not really undermine the importance of ODA as a commitment, 0.7% as a commitment. So I'm coming to the point where I'm going to say possibly something that's obvious to you all, that the most problematic area is not about ODA as a type of flow or ODA as a commitment, but rather the most complicated area is who is setting the rules about what is in or out of ODA. And we know that we have a very short answer to that, and those setting the rules are traditional donors at this moment in time. And we're talking about the OECD and DAC countries. And this is pointing to one of the most debated elements of the current discussions towards, for instance, the FfD4 conference in June, July next year, which is the architecture. They need to reform the architecture of international public finance, and I would argue for the need to reform the entirety of the FfD architecture. And let me know that even in the most recent conversation, it's clear that there is a proper understanding even within that community itself that it's not just good enough to consult, and there is the need to change the rules about decision-making in the space for development and development flows and development effectiveness. But let me know that there are good examples when it comes to governance. A couple of years ago, the UN established a new indicator. I'm referring to the indicator 17.3.1 that is supposed to track additional resources to support local development. And that indicator was agreed by the international community within the UN. So it is possible to agree on the set of rules in a different way. But let me note in the transparency matter that you have that indicator and you have two co-custodian organizations with that indicator. One is OECD and the other is AMTED. So even the future, that's a kind of warning message, even the future, the OECD DAC will be there. Nevertheless, we need to move to a more inclusive process about setting the rules. Another interesting novelty, and coming to my final points, given the time restrictions, another good example of a different kind of architecture is this new metric that is called the total feature for support for sustainable development, which can be criticized in a number of ways, but when it comes to the governance of TOSD, definitely is something we can learn from in terms of the role that non-traditional donors do have within that metric. But let me go back to the issue of the manipulation of the reporting policies. This has been one of the big issues that CSOs have been campaigning against this manipulation for the past 15 and 20 years. And there's a valuable work by many organizations. And let me quote the report from my own constituency, Concord. The Aid Watch report has been very vocal over the past few years, leveraging on the notion of genuine aid, which I would say Zia just mentioning in the opening. And in doing so, let me recall that the most recent changes when it comes to the official reporting rules concern something called the private sector instruments, and CSO community is extremely concerned because the PSI regulations are giving away with a fundamental feature of concessionality, replacing concessionality with development additionality. So let me conclude after I presented you with all these challenges that when it comes to the effectiveness, which is another important discussion that we're going to have today, I would invite you to think in terms of revitalizing the implementation of the current agenda instead of starting from scratch again. I hope this was useful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Luca Di Fraia. Interesting beginning of the debate. Let me bring in the Southern voice. Let me invite Vitalis Meja, the co-chair of the Finance for Development Mechanism in the International Development Cooperation workstream. She will be talking about the redefinition of ODA with the perspective from the recipient countries. Meja, what key elements are missing in the current definition of ODA? In your opinion, you've been working on this. How would you redefine ODA to shift power dynamics to better align with the priorities of the communities and the people at the ground level? So you have 5 minutes to speak on that. Over to you, Meja.
Thank you very much, and I like my new gender. No, really, thank you, and let me thank the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this this discussion. I think when it comes to the issue of definition, I'm a bit at a loss. It's because the norms are very clear. Whether I'm asking myself whether definition is the real problem here, or it is the problem is that of implementation. Because, for example, I'll go into let's start with the qualitative issues. Like, we have gone so far in defining what aid effectiveness is and what development effectiveness is. And if you look at that aspect of work, that has been done collectively with the countries of the South and the countries of the North. So collectively, including even civil society giving input into that debate. And we've defined the norms, we've defined the targets that we all agree with, right? But has that led to behavior change at the country level? No. To the level that we can say that it has translated into localization or deeper ownership or deeper development results at the country level? No. So I don't think the question for me is redefining the norms or a new narrative, whatever. But I think it's something more that we need to put our hands on. And for me, the issue of changing behavior, changing attitude is very political. It is not technical. And this is where I think how we bring citizens, particularly citizens of the North, because the bad behavior is actually coming from the North, not really from the South. One, and why do I say from the North, is because most of the targets that are agreed on internationally, mostly it's them who do not meet those targets. And usually there are various excuses, there's high risk, there's corruption, you know, there are all those sorts of many justification as to why they don't do those things. But when you look at also how that impacts on the flows that come in, that is also not rising. So you find people talking about the highest level of ODA flows in 2023, but you look at the flows into, into countries that actually deserve those flows, those resources are not going there. They're going somewhere else that are not necessarily in Africa or Asia, where the most impoverished are. So you ask yourself, is it really that they do not know the narrative, or they do not know what needs, or which countries need what resources? So there is much more for me, is changing the narrative from the North and how the public in the North begin to push or pressurize their government to really make sure that the norms that have been defined collectively in a global platform are respected and adhered. And I think for me, that is the gap where things need to be addressed. So even if we talk about a new narrative, but the narrative is not embedded in the popular psyche, whether in the North or the South, nothing is going to change. So quickly, let me say, what do countries in the South want? One, they want country leadership and country ownership. where they are the ones who set the agenda, the priorities, and the results framework. And then development partners or donors on the other side align and harmonize their support to those plans. That is very critical for them. But even on the South, I think from us, from a civil society, we are even talking more of a democratic ownership. And here, when you're talking about democratic ownership, it means that the citizens are part and parcel of designing, planning, budgeting, and execution of those priorities. And so in terms of working and changing the narrative, there's a lot more work that needs to be done on getting the citizen involved in those discussions, because the sustainable political pressure can only come from the citizen, who are the taxpayers, and who can determine where resources go and the quality that it ought to be, because that then informs the dialogue in a more sustainable way. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Meja. You have opened up this debate of the acceptance of the narrative and redefining the narrative, both in North and South. Interesting. Let me bring in the other perspective. We have today with us a government representative from Pakistan, Mr. Ali Kamal, Chief Planning Commission of Pakistan, usually plans the use of ODA and applies for ODA, and I don't know, the government in Pakistan, what they think about this ODA effectiveness, and what is his experience. He will be actually sharing with us today. So, Ali, why is it crucial to have ODA, and why should we think on this localization of ODA, and how do you see the recipient countries and local communities being more empowered in shaping ODA priorities? What lessons from the Global South, particularly from Pakistan, should be considered to ensure the ODA is both effective and empowered at the local level? So floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Zasab, and good to be on the forum. As we have already discussed about the ODA in Pakistan, that Pakistan was receiving lots of ODA, and then I think that it was decided somewhere in the world that remittances are more than ODA, and we can equate remittances plus ODA, and Pakistan will get at the end of the year this much of ODA plus remittances. So we can shrink ODA and we can have more remittances. But the thing is that remittances is coming from following the most altruistic values, that the diaspora is outside and they are sending to the families and they are spending it here. Anyways, the topic is very interesting, that how the Global South is looking at it. And the Global South, if they are looking at the localization, and the localization of ODA is basically a process of shifting the focus and controls of foreign aid, which developed countries are giving as a development funds directly to the developing countries. But what happened if we say that let's give it to the local actors in the recipient countries through INGOs, through NGOs, through different organizations who are directly contributing at the ground level. But the thing is, whether they have high administration cost, or they have more leakages than Government of Pakistan, they have not the large organization who can put their foot down in most of the activities in Pakistan. That's all the questions which we want to explore. And basically, as far as the global localization is concerned, the main aim is to enhance local ownership, which effectively says that we may need to build local capacity and ensure that the aid is more responsible to the actual needs of the communities. It is indeed to help. ODA, which is coming to Pakistan directly, that is also through a multi-donor organization or whatever. It is going to the people, but there is no civil society or international NGO, mostly civil society working on it. But the thing is, are we ready for it? That's one of my concerns. And when I say, are we ready for it? Then are we ready for it? Because it has increased share of funds going directly to the local organization, including private sector, NGOs, local governments, community groups, and other implementers. If it is going to the local governments, it is going directly to the people. Though I'm not saying that NGO is not working on that, but they have may have higher, but they will work with the local governments or the DC and the AC and other government part over there. Then we need to build the capacity, local capacity over there as well, whether it's a local organization, local government, community groups, or private sector. Then we have need to tailor to specific social, cultural, economic, and environmental context of the recipient countries, because it is already dictated by all the developed countries that this is what we are going to give it for certain cause, for certain components. And that's it. You are not using it for X if we are giving it for Y, because we think that this is needed for you. And the local communities might say that no, we need X, not Y, because Y we will do it after we will achieve X. So that's the context specific solution which we need to have it. And then we can say the accountability to local population, that projects are designed with inputs from the communities, which is very important as far as the world is concerned, and even the USA and other parts of the world who are very entrenched in the local communities. Even we have in US local county tax, and some counties they do not have tax. So everything is at the local level. So we may project it that let's have a heart, and ODA may be asked from the local communities, local government people, and then it can be distributed through local government or civil society organization or a private sector. That is one way of looking at it. It could be a global south initiative, and that increases the transparency, accountability, and I'm sure that the likelihood of the projects being well received at sustainable level at the local communities. Thank you very much, Yasam.
Thank you very much indeed, Ali. You have always been supporting the localization and local communities, and that's what you have said in the end, that maybe it would have been much better if the ODA might have been utilized by the local communities. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have tried to discuss a little bit about the ODA definition, redefining ODA, and how to make it more localized, and how to engage with the grassroots level communities and local civil society organizations. I hope you might have enjoyed this conversation. We will still continue the conversation on ODA coherence and in the next panel, and maybe we will have a chance to ask questions to our panelists after the next panel. So over to Marianne.
Thank you so much, Zia, and to all of our colleagues in the first panel. And as you say, we now going into the second panel, and where we'll be speaking about enhancing ODA quality and coherence. We've heard many different perspectives in the first panel. For the second panel, we will be hearing from Corentin Martignot from Coordination Sud, Alex Farley from Bond, Emmeline Ciale from PIANGO in the Pacific region, from Hideki Wakabayashi, the director of JANIC, and Matt Simmons from Eurodad. So let's now start with you, Corentin, specifically on the social dimension of aid. Can you explain the social dimension of ODA and why it's essential to focus on human rights and basic needs? And in your view, how can ODA be more responsive to these social dimensions while still addressing broader development goals?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, je vais intervenir en français. Merci Marianne et merci à Forus de me permettre d'intervenir aussi aujourd'hui sur ce sujet majeur. Donc en effet, j'avais envie de vous parler aujourd'hui de l'un des deux piliers majeurs de l'aide publique au développement, de l'APD, qui est son pilier social. puisque lorsque l'APD a été définie, elle a hérité d'une part d'un objectif économique, hein, de contribuer au développement économique d'un certain nombre de pays dits en développement, mais aussi, et c'est ce que nous avons à cœur et que nous définissons d'ailleurs comme le cœur de l'aide publique au développement, un pilier social afin d'améliorer le bien-être, afin d'améliorer le quotidien d'un certain nombre de personnes. Et malgré cette priorité affichée avec cette jambe sociale dans l'aide publique au développement, on constate aujourd'hui un retard important. On constate que c'est une dimension qui n'a pas été prise en compte dans l'augmentation, dans la hausse de l'aide publique au développement. Alors pourquoi ce volet social il est important? Et d'abord, qu'est-ce qu'il désigne? En fait, nous, ce que l'on interprète derrière ce volet social, c'est d'abord et avant tout de financer, de développer l'accès d'un certain nombre de populations à des services sociaux de base, donc à des services essentiels. On pense à l'eau et l'assainissement, à l'éducation, à la santé, à la protection sociale et à l'alimentation, mais aussi à certaines géographies, puisque là aussi, on pense à des pays dits les moins avancés, à des pays à faible revenu, à des pays qui sont dans des situations également de fragilité, de vulnérabilité. Autrement dit, dans des territoires où c'est bien souvent l'accès à ces services essentiels qui fait le plus défaut. Et donc, l'aide publique au développement, elle est bien censée venir pour financer et améliorer l'accès à ces services essentiels, qui sont d'ailleurs au cœur de l'agenda 2030. Ils font partie des premiers objectifs de développement durable, des 6 premiers ODD. Pourtant, lorsque l'on regarde les chiffres de l'aide publique au développement ces dernières années, on constate un véritable retard, sinon une dépriorisation de ce cœur de l'APD, cette APD sociale, puisqu'aujourd'hui, en 2022, seuls 9,5% de l'APD bilatérale était affecté à ces services essentiels. C'est très faible et c'est d'autant plus faible que c'est un montant, un niveau qui est resté plus ou moins constant ces 10 dernières années. Et il faut également avoir en tête que ces 10 dernières années, l'APD a connu des évolutions avec notamment la pandémie de Covid-19 qui a quand même impulsé un sursaut dans les financements dans le secteur de la santé mondiale et de lutte contre les épidémies qui ont quand même connu une augmentation. Mais à l'inverse, à côté, on a d'autres services essentiels, d'autres secteurs sociaux qui ont connu une baisse de leur financement. C'est en particulier le cas de l'accès à l'eau et à l'assainissement, mais aussi dans une moindre mesure le cas du secteur de l'éducation. Donc ça, c'est une première chose. Mais même quand on va regarder aussi sur les géographies, donc sur l'aide qui est allouée aux pays dits les moins avancés, là encore, on est frappé par le retard et par le faible pourcentage, puisqu'il était en 2022 de 26%, seul un quart de l'APD totale était affecté à ces pays dits les moins avancés. C'est donc urgent aujourd'hui d'opérer un recentrage de l'aide publique au développement sur ces priorités qui sont au cœur de la définition de l'aide publique au développement. Il ne s'agit pas de la réinventer aujourd'hui, mais on fait tout de même le constat que la définition de l'APD, elle a évolué pour prendre en compte de nouveaux secteurs, pour financer de nouveaux projets. Mais pour autant, historiquement, cette APD sociale, elle n'a pas connu ces dernières années d'évolution. Et pourquoi est-ce que l'APD d'ailleurs est pertinente pour financer ces services sociaux et pourquoi elle ne peut pas être remplacée par d'autres outils? Parce que l'APD, elle concentre aujourd'hui la majorité des dons qui viennent des pays à haut revenu vers les pays à faible revenu. Et lorsqu'on regarde les différents outils aujourd'hui d'aide publique au développement, on voit bien que c'est principalement et majoritairement par le don qu'on peut aller financer ces services sociaux et pas par d'autres instruments. Par exemple, les prêts, qui sont certes aujourd'hui une petite part de l'APD, mais qui ont beaucoup augmenté ces dernières années dans l'APD bilatérale, ces prêts ne répondent pas aux besoins de financement des services sociaux. Les services sociaux, ils sont à plus de 80% financés par des dons. Et en plus, ces prêts, ils ne s'adressent pas en priorité aux pays à faible revenu. Ils vont au contraire se concentrer sur des pays à revenus intermédiaires. Il y a donc un véritable besoin aujourd'hui de renforcer le don dans l'aide publique au développement pour financer ces services sociaux de base. Et enfin, la dimension sociale de l'aide publique au développement, c'est plus que le financement de ces services sociaux, c'est aussi la mise en relation de communautés, la création de partenariats et le financement des organisations de la société civile. Et ça, c'est essentiel puisque ces organisations de la société civile, elles permettent d'une part de l'existence de régimes démocratiques et ouverts, mais elles permettent également d'autre part de contribuer à l'efficacité de l'aide publique au développement avec le financement de projets dans des secteurs clés tels que l'adaptation au changement climatique, la défense et la promotion des droits humains ou encore la promotion de l'égalité de genre. Donc on voit bien pour conclure aujourd'hui qu'il y a un véritable besoin de concentrer l'aide publique au développement sur des secteurs qui sont prioritaires, hein, donc d'augmenter les dons, d'augmenter donc les financements sur ces secteurs sociaux de base. Il y a d'autres flux de financement au-delà de l'APD qui contribuent au développement durable et qui peuvent être, par exemple, plus pertinents pour aller financer des projets tels que ceux de la transition énergétique ou alors pour mobiliser des financements privés. Mais l'APD, elle, doit être concentrée sur ce cœur et notamment donc sur son APD social. Et merci à vous.
Thank you so much, Corentin. An excellent presentation in terms of some of the challenges and the need to see how best aid can work in terms of providing social services. Let's also hear from Alex Farley from Bond coming up next. There's this term, inflated aid, and I think it's very interesting because it also speaks to the challenges on how aid is used or not used in terms of its effectiveness and reaching those most in need. Can you explain what this means, inflated aid, how it diverts resources away from essential development priorities such as those that Corentin has spoken about? And in your view, what key reforms are needed to address this issue? I mean, there's been this growing concern about inflated aid and the redirection of ODA to areas like climate finance and refugee support. How can we ensure that ODA remains focused on its core mission of development while also addressing these important but sometimes competing priorities? Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks so much to the whole Forus team for bringing us together for this really important discussion. So in answering that, I'm going to be speaking to some of the practical ways that the expanded definition of ODA that Luca was talking about earlier and what is allowed to be counted as ODA is inflating ODA budgets and diverting support from some of the areas that it's needed most. And what we mean by inflated ODA budgets is that more funding is being channeled through to a greater number of priorities that are counting as ODA, as well as through a greater number of instruments that are all being included in the bucket of what counts as ODA. And together, this makes it look like there is more or inflated ODA funding being committed by donors, when actually you've heard from the other panelists, there is less at the moment actually reaching countries and communities who need this concessional finance the most. So this deepens divides and trust, but it also really deepens divide and distrust, but it also really raises questions about the quality of ODA provided. There's a real lack of political will among donors at the moment to meet their 0.7% commitments, and governments are increasingly finding ways to reach their targets without actually putting up more money. And that's contributing to this sense of inflated ODA budgets. So CSOs have been concerned about a number of ways that ODA is potentially being inflated across a number of issues, particularly most recently those legitimized by the OECD DAC's ODA modernization process. Some of these accounting practices that risk inflating ODA are quite technical, and we don't have time to get into all of them, but I think the two that you suggested, Marianne, are good ones. The support for refugees in particular is a good example at the moment of how some donors are sort of gaming the ODA system. So OECD DAC guidance allows donors to count the costs of supporting refugees and asylum seekers for the first 12 months that they're in a donor country as ODA, and that's under the category called in-donor refugee costs. When the OECD DAC laid out these rules, they encouraged a minimalist approach among those reporting in-donor refugee costs as ODA, because of the risk that it had to inflate spend. Many countries have done the exact opposite and have taken a maximalist approach. Here in the UK, where I am, a third of the ODA budget last year was spent on in-donor refugee costs. That's equivalent to £4.3 billion. If you extrapolate outwards, that's 13.8% of DAC member countries' total ODA that was counted as in-donor refugee costs in 2023. And this is money that doesn't leave donor countries. Support for refugees and asylum seekers is, of course, crucial, but donors are taking advantage of being able to take this out of their ODA budgets and thereby spending less of their ODA abroad, meaning less funding for programs that might help prevent displacement in the first place, such as poverty reduction or peace and stability. In the case of Germany and Denmark, neither would have met their 0.7% of GNI commitments in 2022 had they not included in donor refugee costs in their reporting. And in the case of the UK, if you remove the projected costs for support for refugees for the next year, we're anticipating that the UK ODA budget will shrink to its lowest levels in 17 years to 0.36% of GNI. Another complicated issue that you mentioned, but a really critical one, is the reporting of climate finance. So at COP 2015 in 2009, wealthy countries promised to provide new and additional finance to the value of $100 billion by 2020 to support the Global South with their climate change and adaptation efforts. Studies that have tried to track those payments have repeatedly shown that much of the climate finance commitments made are actually being taken directly from existing aid budgets. And that's often retrospectively double counting long-standing aid commitments as climate finance. That's particularly concerning in a year when agreeing a new climate finance goal is crucial. So those are just two of the ways that ODA figures are being distorted. There's also issues like the reporting of vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the agreement reached last year at the OECD DAC that funding channeled through private sector instruments can now be counted as ODA eligible as well. What can we do about it? Well, at Bond, we and our members are currently calling on the UK government to stop funding in-donor refugee costs as ODA. So we want the government to ensure that the costs of supporting refugees and asylum seekers will be met from other sources outside the ODA budget, but to allow ODA funding to flow to the areas abroad where it's needed the most. We're also calling for climate finance to be genuinely new and additional and grant-based and not debt-creating. However, I do think on a more profound level, the issue of inflated ODA shows why it's important to get the rules on what counts as ODA and what doesn't, as well as the reporting practices right. ODA is being used as a geopolitical tool with national interests top of mind when you look at these issues, when it really should be a tool for redistributive justice. And we really need these decisions and discussions on, the definition of ODA, as well as the rules of what counts to include stakeholders who it's actually intended to support. The inflation of ODA is a direct result of these discussions and decisions happening in places where donor priorities take preference over the climate and development priorities of low and middle income countries. And I know other colleagues will talk about that a bit more. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Really great presentation, also from the UK perspective and what can be done with some of the challenges that Alex has highlighted in terms of advocacy at government level. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now over to Emmeline Siale. Siale, from the Pacific Islands. We would really love to hear a different view on this discussion in terms of empowerment, empowering local actors, the importance of their role in development. From your perspective, can you share with us what are the most critical steps we need to ensure that local communities and organizations are not just consulted, but actually lead in ODA decision-making? What role should local organizations play in decision-making and implementation? Thanks, Siale.
Thanks, Marianne. I hope that I'm connected okay.
Yes, we can hear you. And
thank you. My sharing will be focused on PIANGO experiences in working as a regional platform of national umbrella NGOs across 24 countries and territories in the Pacific. But much more in terms of looking at local civil society and communities as part of the decision-making in the design and formulations of public policies to reflect the realities of the people in the communities, and that adequate resources are allocated to deliver on those priorities so communities are accessing to those public services. So for this session, I would like to respond to questions with our experience in our work in the humanitarian space, because I feel like that's the biggest threat of climate change to the lives of our Pacific people. The nexus of humanitarian and sustainable development cannot be separated. so as how we see lives of people should not be separated when we talk about climate change and talk about development in the economic interest that often undermine the reality of our community, particularly when it comes to the decisions on where does aid need to be used to leverage the improvement of the people's life. But I suppose before we continue the conversations around locally led development and how localization should be featured at our national level, there are certain things that we need to perhaps recognize that in the Pacific, aid is owned and managed by donors. And so it's a political tool. The political nature of aid that is reflected in foreign policy interests that led to the geopolitical dynamics that play out in our Pacific region, that complicated things that should not be complicated, often undermine the struggle that our people are dealing with in terms of their resilience to the climate threats. Aid benefits are captured by only a few within the countries at the expense of the poor marginalized communities. And so the whole colonial nature of aid is still very much present in how we see it being rolled out in our region. There are so many things that we need to perhaps not just focus on whether it's, what steps that we need to take. For example, the conversations around, development has been around for a while, but it's now being taken up in our region to take a different perspective from civil society, from community, to recognize the devastating nature of the impact of climate change, and to top that off the disappropriations of engaging of civil society in trying to manage development and in the inequality that is emerging because of the discourse of sustainable development and the conversations around aid and all that, has really elevated to a point that we should pay attention, that we need a healing process when we deal with people. And that's very much the case in the Pacific. So rather than just like looking at how do we deal with looking at aid in terms of sustainable development, or look at that aid in terms of leveraging a well-being of our people, we need to also recognize, if we are talking about where that's the critical step that we need to take, we need to also look at the well-being of our people, particularly in the Pacific, because the inequality is huge, that we have to bring the level of interventions from a healing process. And we are now talking about that a lot here in our region, when we are talking about engaging our community in the decision-making, engaging our community and our citizens in developing, intervention developing program that should promote better life, better standard. Those participations of community is a healing process. And so that has now becoming quite popular in some of our civil society conversations, that we are now starting to look at what are the steps that we need to take. Is that we need to also always look at engaging people, make them part of their decision-making as a healing process. The other point that I have to make is the spaces that we allow for civil society to engage has to be invested in terms of allow our own civil society space to develop our own position, because it's a negotiated space. Oftentimes when donors come and ask us, what do you want? Or what does the Pacific want? We don't know. Why? because there has not been any space that allows civil society to talk among ourselves and consensus around what exactly our position. So that when we go in as a collective, we have a stronger opportunity of making sure that our priorities and our, priorities that reflect the reality of our people is actually at the core of all of that. So in terms of our humanitarian response work, there are three key areas that we would really want to see that is being part of the developing the critical steps. One is our leadership, which speaks to how we have to engage people in making decision-making. The second one is funding, and the other one is capacity. Those are the three key things that we really need to invest our time articulating when it comes to aid. Funding, and we're talking about core funding, because that will make the changes in how we see our decision being part of the process, and building capacity so we be able to understand and negotiate in those spaces. Thank you, Marian.
Thank you so much, Cielo, for your presentation, and also to acknowledge it is very late in the Pacific Islands region. So thank you so much for sharing your insights quite late at night on your side. So thank you. We have two more presentations for the second panel. Hideki, we're going to show your slides as well. And we would like for you to discuss, please, the connection between ODA, financing for development, and peace and security, with a focus on East Asia. How can ODA be leveraged more effectively to support stability and peace in regions such as Japan in East Asia? Thank you, Hideki. 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I briefly explained the linkage between the ODA and peace and security, focusing on East Asia. Next slide, please. I would like to briefly explain what the Japanese ODA looks like. Japan is number 3rd after the US and Germany. It is 2022 figures. And Japan used to be the top donor, far top donor in 1990s, but now number 3rd. Next slide, please. This is a percentage of GNI. Right now, Japan is 0.39, and far below that 7.7% target. And for example, in terms of the percentage, United States is very low, and UK and Germany is very high. Next slide, please. Okay, this is ODA budget, and the 2024 is almost the half level of 1997, has been decreasing. So it used to be a top donor, but since 1997, it's decreasing. But ODA budget level is only 7% of defense budget in 2024. Next, please. And this is Japanese defense budget, has been increasing last 3-4 years. And right now, 10 years from now, 10 years ago, it's almost double for the 2025 right now, about $60 billion. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a situation of potential military conflicts in East Asia. As you can see that the United States and China is confronting in Asia, in East Asia. So that so many US bases and China's bases, but presence of United States has been decreasing, weakening. So that Japan have to take some role of the United States last several years. Next slide, please. So you can see some growing potential military conflicts, a lot of pressures from China, invading other countries' territories, military drills surrounding Taiwan, dispute in territorial dispute in many places. And I think geopolitical divisions are intensifying in East Asia. Next, please. So I think in Japan, increasing public support to defense rather than ODA budget. That's one of the reasons that the ODA has been increasing last several years, looking at those situation in Asia. And government says strategic utilization in international cooperation, including ODA. And Ministry of Foreign Affairs established OSA, which is Official Security Assistance, in 2023 to enhance the security capability and the deterrence of allied nations. And ODA charter was revised last year. And OSA recipient countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and those East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Pacific Island. So this is what has happening in East Asia and Asia. Next slide. Next. So what we're going to do to need to stabilize finance for development in the region. But my point is we have to understand the realities of international politics and security. And countries have the right to defend themselves. But we have to find out what would be the appropriate level of the defense budget and how we could increase our ODA budget. But international cooperation is indispensable for eliminating any kinds of threats, such as extreme poverty, protecting basic freedom, and solving structural problems to stabilize the region based on the multilateralism. So there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. This is from the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we have to need to gain public support for strengthening development finance. And we have to appeal to the realistic logic for regional stability with ODA. Of course, Japanese government is responsible to gain support from the public and try to increase 0.7% target. But at the same time, CSOs are also responsible to getting support from the public to increase ODA. But we have not done successfully in getting support. This is another big challenge we have to do for the next 10 years or so. Thank you very much. Back to Marianne.
Thank you so much, Hideki, for that very insightful presentation and the focus on linking peace, security, sustainable development. Thank you. We have one last presentation. We're going just a few minutes over time, but it's the last one for panel 2 before the Q&A. So over to you, Matt from Eurodad, specifically on privatization of aid. We see this as a growing trend in recent years. And we'd love to hear from you on unpacking what those risks and implications are related to this trend, especially in terms of transparency and accountability of development aid. How can we counteract these risks while maintaining private sector engagement? In addition, there's an increasing call for the reform of ODA governance structures to ensure that recipient countries have a stronger voice in decision-making processes. What specific reforms do you think are most needed to shift the power dynamics and make ODA governance more inclusive and equitable? Over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marian. Thank you, Forus, for inviting us to join you today and share some observations, some recommendations on these two subjects. Obviously, I'm not going to really be able to do much more than scratch the surface on these issues, which are interrelated, but Eurodad has done quite a bit of work, especially on exposing the risks of the private sector in development cooperation, and specifically on private sector instruments. And so after my quick contribution here, I'll drop a link in the chat where you can dig deeper into some of this research that we've done. So just to start on this question of private sector, I mean, it's true that the narrative around private sector and development cooperation has really picked up in the last decade or so, especially in the development community, in these aid circles. But I think for those that have been around for a while, it's fair to say it's it's been part of the general policy approach for quite a bit longer, especially within the donor community and the sort of their institutions. So that's basically to say that the liberalization, the free market, private sector oriented approach to development has always been at the heart of the donor agenda, whether we're talking about bilateral development cooperation, or we're talking about the IFIs and MDBs and what they are doing. So donor policies has always had this underlying motive of supporting development countries with their aid, but sort of with this caveat of creating better market access conditions for their own companies. I think some countries, some donors have been a bit more explicit about this than others by expressly within their policies, expressly referencing the benefits of their aid to their own domestic interests. But I think more recently, there's been a more obvious shift to actually use ODA to support private sector activities and financing modalities more directly or explicitly. I think we would say this reached a fever pitch when the World Bank introduced this buzz phrase or concept of turning billions to trillions, I guess suggesting that trillions of development financing is needed to deliver the SDGs, but we only have billions, or so they were suggesting. I get what they really meant was, but as demonstrated by how they acted afterwards, was to focus on heavily leveraging public money and ODA to raise private money to help deliver the SDG agenda. And it was, orienting us a little bit towards this financing for development process. It was very much a feature of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which put a great amount of emphasis on instruments like blended finance to fill the financing gap. I think it's fair to say that a majority in civil society have always been a bit skeptical of this effort to engage the private sector in private finance, not least because the motivations of the private sector are by and large at odds with the role and purpose that we envision for development cooperation, which is to say the sort of this insatiable thirst for profit versus a sort of a development justice approach that puts people and planet first. We were and we remain very concerned about the transparency and accountability of the private sector and private finance, about the actual development impact it can have, the diversion of resources that are already very limited to an actor that frankly doesn't need this kind of support, and at worst, that the private sector's activities will actually undermine some of the SDGs and targets and the general development agenda that we're all in pursuit of. Despite the efforts of and the criticisms of civil society, the march towards the private sector has continued unabated, and what's more is the rules have now been gamed to further incentivize using private sector instruments to expand the envelope, as they like to say, of available finance. We never found the case to use public funds to support private sector particularly convincing, and we're especially opposed to the efforts that were part of this ODA modernization process, which has come up earlier discussions or earlier presentations, which essentially relaxed a lot of the rules and the criteria around what is DACable, or in other words, what could be counted as ODA. Luca mentioned at the outset, but this process dropped the criteria of resources needing to be concessional in character to allow a resource that is non-concessional in nature to be quantified as ODA based on a sort of a very vague concept of additionality. One of the more glaring examples of this, even if it doesn't account for huge volumes, but it just demonstrates sort of what we're talking about, is counting credit guarantees as ODA. So in this case, money that it's never actually transferred is counted as ODA due to the implied risk that a donor is taking on by issuing a credit guarantee. So this is where we're at. The the DAC has agreed new rules roughly 1 year ago on how to quantify ODA through PSIs, private sector instruments. And we expect that over the long term, this will be a strong incentive for donors to start allocating more of their ODA through these channels. I could say confess that I'm not exactly sure what to expect in the short term, because there's some indication that donors will need to adapt their systems to be in line with these new rules. which I guess on a positive side have some better provisions when it comes to reporting, requiring more transparency on these flows and what they're used for. So we'll see. In the short term, it could be very well that we see a reduction in private sector instruments or the use of private sector instruments, at least in some countries or by some donors. But over the long term, with these rules in place, I think it's safe to say that they're there to encourage more aid to be channeled through these instruments in the future. We have a few recommendations in response to this development, if you want to call it that. In the first instance, is to ask donors to prioritize grants as a preferred modality and to deliver ODA through more traditional methods like budget support and programs at country level. Secondly, while the rules on PSI reporting will hopefully increase transparency on these flows, we must insist on full transparency on any public money that goes through development finance institutions, which are generally the institutions that carry out these kinds of activities for the bilateral donors and other private sector entities, including the operations they carry out by demonstrating actual impact and additionality. Third, to ensure that private sector activities supported by ODA strictly adhere to the long list of or various types of principles that have been laid out and agreed by governments. We have the effectiveness principles, we have the blended finance principles, we have the Kampala principles, and we have impact standards for financing for sustainable development. All of these should be strictly adhered to in terms of these flows. And finally, probably the most critical would be to have an external assessment of the entire modernization process with a view to reversing the decisions that came out of it. So all this leads me to the next topic, which is the reform of the ODA governance structures. How is it linked to the reform of the ODA governance structures? Well, there are a few elements to this, but the short answer is that the rule changes to ODA, which have created these conditions to incentivize the use of private sector instruments, they've really drastically changed the game, are part of a bigger problem or a demonstration of a bigger problem of ODA governance. And that is that these rules were changed at the OECD DAC, an exclusive group of 32 countries behind closed doors with only a very limited scope for input from non-DAC constituents. It may well be, however unlikely, that you or I think it might be, that these rule changes might have happened in a more representative institution. That's really not the point, or isn't necessarily the point. The point is that the members of the DAC, whether they're well-intentioned or not, have dramatically altered the ODA measure in a way that will have profound implications on how aid is delivered, and done so regardless of whether or not it aligns with the interests of the countries where their aid goes. And that, for us, is the fundamental problem. And that is why we're asking for a fundamental overhaul of the international aid governance. And that is why, as part of ours and many in civil society's demands for the FfD4, that the conference agree in its outcome that a new international development cooperation architecture is needed, and that architecture has a universal representation, equal voice in decision-making. And it will be the cornerstone of our overarching and most ambitious demand to have a framework convention on international development cooperation, which I'd be happy to speak to further in the Q&A and dialogue session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. I like how you've wrapped up with some very good recommendations, and also in the context of FfD4 coming to address many challenges, not just as from what you have shared related to private sector engagement, but also looking at many of the other challenges, political will, inclusivity, community voices, and so forth. So thanks so much. And right now we actually have our Q&A session. We've gone over time. Maybe we can have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, depending how many questions there may be. You can perhaps raise your hand and we can open your microphone if there are any questions for panelists to ask at this stage. It's been quite a thorough conversation with colleagues that have taken their time, who have worked on this issue for decades, and very enlightening to hear where we are in terms of what's happening at this current juncture, and also looking at the possibilities of future solutions in the kind of path right now towards FFD4, where we know the finance is too little in terms of delivering the SDGs. Are there any hands up? I'm trying to see, there's just I see in the Q&A someone from World Vision Japan, Noriko Shibata. Would you like to ask your question while we hear? Perhaps there might be others. And after Noriko, I'm not sure if you're still there in the call, but I also see that Corentin has responded. If everyone has access also to the Q&A, you can also read the question. Noriko, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Noriko Shibata from World Vision Japan. I also had communicated through the Q&A with Corentin about the worries from the civil society about the use of ODA to the private sector as a to catalyze the private sector finance to the development countries. It's also mentioned in the Pact for the Future that the direction of the use of ODA as a catalyst for the private sector financing to developing countries. And what I'm concerning is that based on the presentation from Corentin, that only 99% of ODA goes to the basic services. But if the ODA will be used as a catalyst for the private sector financing, we are worrying about the more and more the ODA will be used, shrinking the ODA to be used for the most marginalized people. So I already discussed with Corentin in the Q&A box, but I also would like to explain him to explain about what we should care about this direction, and what can we do as a civil society to this direction. And also this is really relating to the question of the presentation by Matthew from Eurodad. So I also would like to ask his perspective on this point. Thank you very much.
Right. I think Corentin has responded to your question.
Yeah.
Would you maybe first let's take a question from Zia, and then we can go to Matt to respond a little bit more on your question. Go ahead, Zia.
Thank you, Marin. In fact, this is common saying that who holds the purse is the real decision maker. So, of course, we receive the priorities from the global north to use the funds under the ODA. I would like to ask Ali Kamal from the government of Pakistan, at any point of time in his life while dealing with these ODA processes, and then if ODA aids, whether there was any opportunity for you or for government of Pakistan to ask for ODA in in a priority which is decided by the government of Pakistan themselves, one. The second is that I was a little bit confused by the response on my question to Hideki, because I've heard that he was talking about OSA, official security assistance. So what is the difference between OSA and ODA? And what I have observed that some of the human rights activists have been talking about this use of ODA as a military aid, how we can actually minimize such opportunities when the global north uses the ODA funds to support the military in various countries. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. So perhaps we'll just go in the order of the questions. First, to respond to the first question from Noriko to Matt. Then we'll go to our representative from the government of Pakistan, and then to Hideki for the last question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think Corentin has given quite a good response in the text. I mean, I would add, there's probably at various levels that we would try to, or let's say, what measures can be taken. First, at the sort of global, sort of intergovernmental policy level, I mean, what we're asking for as a global civil society right now is that there be a sort of stricter definition of what is actually can be considered development cooperation and what can be considered official development assistance. That, as I said, had changed drastically with this modernization process. So that's taken in tandem with this idea of moving the governance of aid into a more representative body. And they're then thinking about what, giving something of a political definition to development cooperation, so that, you know, going forward, you wouldn't be able to see these kinds of flows being counted as development cooperation. You wouldn't be seeing resources diverted to those to these instruments that are already quite limited. That's quite an ambitious, obviously, as we know, an ambitious endeavor that we're trying to take on. Realistically, if we're realistic, I don't know that we'll be able to achieve that by next summer. More concretely, I would say then it goes down to, and it would be interesting to hear from colleagues that are from the national platforms to respond to this. It comes to it becomes incumbent upon the sort of national platforms to try to influence how their governments allocate their budgets, because there's no strict and hard rule that says more ODA has to be channeled to or through private sector instruments. That's a decision taken at sort of the national policy level when governments are sort of allocating their aid budgets. So then it's about having, you know, the national civil society try to intervene in some way and you know, insist on a legitimate case for having those resources go to these kinds of modalities. And yeah, then it's down to how national platforms can influence their own governments and what means they have to do that at the national level.
Thanks very much, Kamal. And just we'll have another couple minutes just to hear from Mr. Ali Kamal, and then from Hideki. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And thank you, Ziasab, again, asking a question very pertinent. Actually, whenever the ODA decided, it is in consultation with the government sometimes, but then there are consultants involved in some of the tasks, that what exactly we should do and what exactly we should offer to the developing countries. And for example, there is an out-of-school children issue in Pakistan. So we may ask the out-of-school children, we have the issue, so please help us. And they will come up with okay, we will have the capacity building exercise with you for the teachers, and you can hire the teachers for the hiring teachers. So main issue was out-of-school children, but they are giving us on for the capacity building exercise. So they are blending in some way that we are spending some bucks on out-of-school children from our own money, and then the ODA will be on for the capacity building exercise. But as far as the global south or localization, which we have discussed over here in Pakistan, we were very clear that these must be given then after the consultation of the local communities, that what exactly do they want instead of the international consultant doing the consultancy for Pakistan, and they come up with some conclusions, and then they offer us that this is what we're offering, $1.5 billion for the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
I'd like, okay, Marianne, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for asking a very interesting question about the OSA. It's a very tough question. I think we tend to criticize the establishment of OSA from the civil society point of view, but OSA is important for those countries to increase their defense capability as well as ODA. But it's very hard to draw the line between the ODA and the OSA. For example, in the case of Philippines, Coast Guard ship is ODA, but small ship is for military use is OSA. So, but Coast Guard attended the military drill in the case of Philippines, but it's very hard to draw the line. And OSA, we cannot negotiate with the government because they say, we are told that the OSA is not ODA. So this is out of issue that we could consult. But I think it's we have to discuss this kind of a question from now on. I think it's both OSA and ODA is important, but we have to increase. We like to increase the ODA up to the 7.7% for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hideki. I've just put in the chat box because I am concerned about people's time. If there are any other questions, we would like to make use of the Q&A as we wrap up. So right now I'm going to hand over to Arturo, and then we are going to have Forus Director Sarah Strack to conclude our event. So thanks. Over to Arturo.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you very much also to all the panelists and all the participants in this very engaging side event. We would like to invite you now to take just 20 seconds to complete a micro survey to let us know how satisfied you are with today's side event, how useful you found it. It will only take you 20 seconds, but it's very important because it will allow us to shape our future events and meetings. So it's very important that you give us your feedback. Please just take 20 seconds. You can either scan the QR code that you have on the screen, or you can also click on the links that my colleagues are also sharing in the chat box. Thank you so much for your feedback in advance. And now I'm handing over back to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Arturo, and thanks to everyone for all your patience and staying with us. I'm now going to ask our director of Forus, Sarah Strack, to conclude and share some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you to all our speakers and participants for a very rich discussion today. Lots of very interesting angles and very important issues that we as a CSO community, but in partnership with everyone, all the stakeholders need to address going forward. It's really clear that now is a critical time, and we've heard about a number of worrying trends regarding ODA, whether it's about inflated aid, like we heard from Alex about counting some, for example, in-country refugee costs as ODA, that then lead to sometimes the biggest recipients of ODAs being actually, as Corentin said in the chat, some European countries, which seems utterly wrong. We've heard about the increasing trend about private sector instruments and the privatization of that, which leads to some key questions and some need to really interrogate what's happening right now. We heard about about sometimes the use of ODA for geopolitical priorities through the presentations of Hideki and also about Cialis intervention in the Pacific, and a number of other issues that are really leading us to need to push for more quality in ODA going forward. There are really, really interesting contributions about the need to really change the rules about decision making, as Luca explained at the beginning, and the need for a more inclusive process in setting those rules. And Matt reinforced that at the end, explaining that the new international cooperation architecture is needed with a more equal representation and who really does have a say. Of course, we've heard also from Mr. Ali Kamal about the importance of localization, of more finance going directly to local organizations, but also the need to build capacity at the local level. That was also reinforced by Ciali, which is something that is really crucial as well. So other interesting, very interesting insights were also shared about the need, for example, or about the question about how how can we bring about behavior change, and the point that maybe it's not so much the kind of initial intent of ODA and this need of focusing on basic social services, as we heard from Corentin, for example, that needs to be revisited, but it does need to be reaffirmed, and we need to make sure that it really translates into deeper ownership at the local level and real benefits for people and communities on the ground. So it's also about changing behaviors and attitudes and making sure that we can trigger the political will to actually go to the core of what ODA is meant to be and the core definition of what we want to achieve in terms of sustainable development. So this is indeed very, very political, as has been said by several of the presenters today. And you know, in addition of all of us working together to create an ecosystem that is more equal, that is more transparent, that is more accountable in order to achieve change, it also needs to be embedded in a narrative, or more importantly, in citizens' pressure, basically, to make sure that we really achieve what we want to achieve with ODA. So lots of really, really valuable contributions. And as has been also mentioned at the end, this is a really pivotal time, because next year the FFD4 conference is going to take place, where it's really important that we set the benchmark, or the founding steps, if you want, for a new architecture, or a revitalized architecture that is much more equal and much more impactful for those most in need. So as we move forward, I hope that the discussions that we've had today will really serve as a call to action for all of us, whether civil society, government representatives, international organizations, donors, all the stakeholders, and that we work together to define and deliver ODA that is of much higher quality and much more benefiting and much more inclusive of local people and communities. And sorry, I'm looking at the time. It's really hard to summarize all these excellent contributions. So maybe just to say another word of thanks to all of you, all our presenters today, all participants, all Forus members who've contributed to this event, to our host Marianne, as well as our interpreters. Please let's continue these conversations beyond today's event and ensure together that we really push for ODA that really becomes a tool for transformative change. Thank you again to all of you for your time, and we look forward to being in touch and to continuing those discussions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the day, especially those in New York who are just starting. All the best with the Summit of the Future. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful
Thank you.
facilitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.